dark like it was a luxury I'd finally earned. The room smelled faintly of roses, my roses, because even secrecy in my life came with petals and polish. The only light came from a wall of monitors. Small squares of my own home, my own hallway, my own bedroom, my own memories, broadcast back to me like a private trial. On the biggest screen, my son was laughing. Robert stood in the showroom of a funeral home, crisp shirt, confident shoulders, that easy grin he used when he wanted something. Rachel was beside him, phone in hand, scrolling like she was ordering dinner. And there it was, a high-end casket, satin-lined, white as whipped cream. Robert leaned over it, then, like a boy daring his friends, he climbed in. He stretched out inside that silk, hands folded over his chest, and let out a satisfied sigh. "Honestly," he said, smiling up at Rachel, "this one's nice. She'd love it." Rachel didn't even look offended. She only tilted her head, assessing the price tag. "Not the gold hardware," she said. "That's just tacky. But the lining? Keep the lining." Robert laughed again. Mom always wanted quality. On the screen, my son closed his eyes and pretended to be dead. In my chair, I didn't flinch. I didn't gasp. I didn't put a hand to my mouth the way women in movies do. I only whispered to the dark, to the cameras, to the quiet that had been building in me for years. I sat very still in my chair. The room around me was silent, except for the faint hum of equipment. Rose stood near the doorway, arms folded, posture straight, saying nothing. She had the discipline of someone who has seen worse. On another screen, the timestamp glowed red in the corner. This was legal, documented, authorized, but it still felt like watching something forbidden. I leaned slightly forward. "I spent $50,000 to stage my own death," I said quietly to the dark room. "Not because I want to die, because I want to know who's already planning it." Rose didn't react. On the screen, Robert opened one eye and looked up at Rachel. "You think she'll fight it?" he asked. Rachel shrugged. "She's old, Robert. People expect decline at her age. A few medical opinions and it won't even look strange." He sat up inside the coffin. "We just need to move carefully." Move carefully. He climbed out and brushed imaginary dust off his jacket. The funeral director approached them with a professional smile. "This model is one of our premium selections," he explained. Robert nodded thoughtfully. "We want the best for her," he said. The best. I remembered the day he was born. 31 hours of labor. I remember gripping the hospital rails and whispering, "Please be healthy." I didn't ask for brilliance. I didn't ask for wealth. I asked for health and kindness. When they placed him in my arms, he looked up at me with unfocused eyes, and I felt something irreversible settle inside my chest. Now I was watching that same boy test the comfort of a coffin he assumed would hold me soon. Rachel tilted her head toward the director. "What's the earliest available service?" "Assuming paperwork is complete," the director replied. "We could arrange something within 48 hours. Robert and Rachel exchanged a glance. Efficient, decisive, prepared. I reached for the small remote on the side table and muted the audio for a moment. The silence pressed against me like a second skin. Grief would have been easier. Anger would have been louder. But what I felt was clarity, not rage, not heartbreak. Assessment. My husband used to say, if you ever doubt someone, watch what they do when they think no one sees them. So I did. On another monitor, I switched angles. There was my living room, my staircase, my bedroom, the house I built with decades of early mornings and ledger books. The house Robert now discussed as inventory. Rose stepped closer to the screens. "You're steady," she observed quietly. "I had practice," I replied. She didn't ask what I meant. I meant marriage, widowhood, running a business while men told me I'd fail, listening more than I spoke. On the main screen, Robert shook hands with the funeral director. "We'll take it," he said. "The premium package," he smiled. It was the same smile he gave me last week when he said, "Mom, you've worked hard your whole life. Maybe it's time to simplify." Simplify. Yes, that's what they call erasure when they want it to sound gentle. I leaned back in my chair and let the screens glow against the silk of my dress. This was only the beginning, because if my son was willing to rehearse my funeral, I was willing to attend it. The beginning of the end did not sound dramatic. It sounded like ice clinking against a glass. That afternoon, sunlight fell across my kitchen floor in long rectangles, warming the old oak planks my husband installed himself. I had just poured iced tea and told Robert I was going upstairs to rest. I even pressed my hand lightly to my temple for effect. "I've been a little forgetful lately," I said gently. Rachel's eyes sharpened at that word. Forgetful. It was the first breadcrumb. I walked upstairs slowly, counting my steps for no reason other than to feel steady. When I reached the landing, I didn't go into my bedroom. I stepped into the pantry closet off the hallway instead and left the door slightly open. Below me, the house settled into quiet. Then their voices began. Rachel spoke first. "We cannot keep living like this." Her tone was tight, controlled, the way she sounds when she's about to present a solution she's already decided on. Robert exhaled. "I know." "No, you don't," she snapped softly. "You think this is temporary. It's not. The credit lines are maxed. The investment didn't land. We are drowning." There it was, the thing they had never fully admitted to me. Debt. I stayed still, hand braced against a shelf of canned soup. Robert lowered his voice. "We'll figure it out." Rachel laughed once, sharp, humorless. "We are figuring it out. That house is sitting on nearly $2 million in equity. My house. Our house," I almost corrected in my mind. Robert hesitated. "It's Mom's." Rachel didn't miss a beat. "For now." The word floated up the staircase and wrapped around my throat. "For now." Robert paced. I could hear his shoes against the hardwood. "She's attached to it," he said. "Dad built half of it himself." "And Dad is gone," Rachel replied. "Sentiment doesn't pay off a lender." Silence stretched between them. Then Rachel said the sentence that changed everything. "She's 72, Robert. She doesn't need 4 bedrooms and a garden she can barely manage. A smaller place would be safer, cleaner, easier." Robert didn't answer immediately. Rachel softened her tone, sliding into persuasion. "A nice facility," she continued. "Somewhere with staff. She'll have company. She'll have activities. We'll visit." Containment disguised as care. Robert finally spoke. "She'd fight it." Rachel let out a breath. "Not if she thinks it's her idea, or if we get a medical evaluation suggesting cognitive decline." The air left my lungs in one controlled release. Medical evaluation. They weren't just discussing logistics. They were strategizing. Robert's voice dropped lower. "You're talking about declaring her unfit." "I'm talking about protecting our future," Rachel corrected. "You said yourself she's been forgetting things." A calculated pause. "Besides," she added, "once the house is sold, we can clear everything. Fresh start. No more pressure." I felt the word pressure settle heavily in my chest. Pressure to move me. Pressure to reposition me. Pressure to minimize me. Robert leaned against something. I heard the faint creak. "I don't want to hurt her." Rachel's reply came swift and clinical. "Then don't think of it as hurting her. Think of it as transitioning her." Transitioning, as if I were a department being restructured. Robert's voice grew quieter, conflicted but weakening. "We'd need her signature." Rachel didn't hesitate. "There are ways." Those 2 words carried more weight than any shout. "There are ways." I stood in the pantry, not trembling, not crying, listening, because that is what mothers do best. We listen long before we speak. Robert sighed. "Let's just ease into it. Start talking about simplifying. See how she reacts." Rachel's tone shifted again, strategic calm. "Exactly. We don't push. We guide. Guide." I closed my eyes. In the early years of my business, I used to say the same thing to young employees. We don't force clients. We guide them. Influence feels gentler than control. Downstairs, ice clinked again. Rachel laughed softly at something on her phone. Robert said, almost casually, "If she moved by fall, we could list before winter." I counted 3 heartbeats. 4. 5. Then I stepped back from the pantry door and walked quietly into my bedroom. I sat on the edge of the bed where my husband used to sit while tying his shoes. I looked at the photograph on my nightstand. Robert at 8 years old, missing front teeth, holding a sunflower bigger than his face. He used to run into my arms without hesitation. Now he was calculating square footage. I did not cry. Tears would have meant surprise. What I felt instead was confirmation. When they left later that afternoon, Robert kissed my cheek. "You rest, Mom," he said warmly. "You've done enough for everyone." Rachel smiled at me with that polished sympathy she wears like jewelry. "We just want what's best for you." I held her gaze for 2 full seconds. "So do I replied. That evening, after the house went quiet, I made a phone call. The woman who answered introduced herself simply. "Legacy Integrity. How can we help?" I did not raise my voice. I did not dramatize. I told her exactly what I heard. And when I finished, she said calmly, "Mrs. Davis, you have options." Options, not as a victim, as a strategist. I looked around my kitchen. The oak floors, the framed wedding photo, the business awards lining the hallway. Everything I built. Everything they thought was ready to be transitioned. "No," I said quietly into the phone. "I don't want revenge." There was a pause. "I want clarity." And that is how the test began. The meeting took place in a glass building that looked like it had never known dust. Legacy Integrity occupied the 12th floor. No flashy signage, no dramatic branding, just a brushed steel plaque beside a quiet reception desk and a woman who greeted me as if I were not fragile, not confused, not nearing expiration. "Mrs. Davis," she said warmly, "they're ready for you." They, not him, not a single savior, a system. Inside the conference room sat two people, a senior attorney named Daniel Reeves and a woman in her early 40s with steady eyes and posture that suggested discipline rather than decoration. "I'm Rose Carter," she said, extending her hand. "Security and compliance. Security, compliance, words that usually belong to corporations, not families." I sat down and folded my hands on the table. Daniel opened a folder. "Before we discuss strategy, I need to be clear. Nothing we do will involve falsifying medical records, impersonating state authorities, or committing fraud. Everything will operate within private legal boundaries." "I'm not interested in illegal theater," I replied. Rose's mouth curved slightly at that. Daniel nodded. "Good. Then what you're describing is what we call a structured integrity test. It's essentially a controlled social experiment within your own private property, documented, consent-based, and legally protected." I let that settle. "Explain." Daniel steepled his fingers. "You suspect financial coercion. You suspect potential manipulation around capacity or property transfer. Rather than wait for something irreversible, you create a monitored environment in which intent reveals itself. In plain English," Rose added calmly, "you let them believe you're vulnerable." There it was. Vulnerable. I considered the word carefully. "I don't like pretending to be weak," I said. Rose's gaze didn't waver. "You're not pretending to be weak. You're pretending to be underestimated. There's a difference." That difference mattered. Daniel slid several documents toward me. "These authorize discreet monitoring in common areas of your home," he explained. "No bathrooms, no guest privacy violations. Everything stays within property you legally control." He pointed to another section. "This establishes a revocable living trust with temporary conditional triggers. If your son attempts to pressure you into signing documents or accessing assets under false pretenses, we have recorded proof of intent." "And the medical angle?" I asked. "We do not fabricate diagnoses," Daniel said firmly. "However, you may voluntarily seek a cognitive baseline evaluation from a licensed physician. That establishes documented competence before any alleged decline narrative can be introduced." Smart, preventive, strategic. Rose leaned forward slightly. "My role will be personal support. I'll pose as a private wellness aide, completely lawful if contracted. I'll observe, document, and ensure your safety." I looked at her hands. Steady, professional, not intrusive. "And the cost?" I asked. Daniel didn't flinch. "Approximately $50,000. The number hung between us. The same number I had just watched Robert approve for a casket. I almost smiled. "Worth it," I said quietly. The paperwork took 2 hours, every signature deliberate, every clause reviewed. When I finished, Daniel closed the folder. "This is not about humiliation," he said gently. "It's about informed truth." "I don't need them humiliated," I replied. "I need them revealed." Rose drove me home that afternoon. On the way, she asked no unnecessary questions. She didn't offer sympathy. She didn't offer judgment. Only once did she glance at me and say, "Are you prepared for what you might see?" I looked out the window at familiar streets. "I already saw enough," I answered. The installations happened over the next 3 days. Small cameras integrated into existing objects, a mantel clock in the living room, a picture frame in the hallway, a decorative vase near the staircase. Not spy gadgets, subtle, compliant, defensible. Rose moved into the guest bedroom under a contractual agreement as my part-time wellness companion. To Robert and Rachel, she would be a precaution. To me, she was an anchor. Then came the performance. It started with minor forgetfulness, misplacing my reading glasses, repeating a question twice, asking Robert what day it was when I already knew. Rachel noticed immediately. "You've been tired lately," she observed one afternoon. "Age does that," I replied with a faint smile. Robert watched me closely, not with concern, with calculation. A week later, I forgot the PIN to one of my smaller accounts in front of him. His eyes flickered. Opportunity. That night, Rose and I sat in the monitoring room reviewing footage. "His body language changes when finances enter the conversation," she noted clinically. "Yes," I said. "He leans forward." Predatory instinct disguised as involvement. A few days later, Daniel delivered the next piece of the plan. A decoy inheritance portfolio. It looked authentic. Draft estate adjustments, asset summaries, projections, completely non-binding, completely strategic. We placed it in my bedroom drawer, somewhere easy to find, somewhere tempting. The stage was set. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I felt something unexpected. Not fear, not excitement. A quiet mourning. Because no matter what this test revealed, I already knew one truth. No mother wins when she has to investigate her own child. Still, clarity requires courage. And I had decided, if Robert was willing to plan my exit, I was willing to plan the truth. The first drawer they opened was not the one with the documents. It was the one with my husband's cufflinks. I was sitting in the living room armchair, wrapped in a soft gray blanket, a book open in my lap. My eyes were half closed, my breathing slow and even. Rose had just stepped out to take a call. The house was quiet enough to hear hesitation. Robert stood in the doorway of my bedroom for a full 10 seconds before entering. Rachel followed 2 steps behind him, heels careful against the hardwood, as if politeness could soften intrusion. "She's asleep," Rachel whispered. Robert glanced back toward the hallway. "You're sure?" Rachel leaned forward slightly and looked at me from the doorway. I let my head tilt gently to one side. "She won't wake up," Rachel said. "She barely notices when we leave." That stung more than I expected. They moved inside. On the monitor in the adjoining room, where Rose now stood watching, I could see everything from the angle of the picture frame on the wall. Robert approached the dresser first. He hesitated, then opened the top drawer. Inside lay small relics of a life that no longer required audience approval. Folded handkerchiefs, my husband's old watch, cufflinks he wore only on holidays. Robert picked up the watch. He turned it over in his hand. "For resale?" Rachel asked quietly. Robert shrugged. "Maybe." He placed it on the dresser, separate from the rest, as if already categorizing. Rachel moved to the closet. "She has so much stuff," she murmured. "It's overwhelming." It wasn't overwhelming. It was history. They opened boxes, lifted lids, sifted through decades of preservation. Then Rachel found the folder, the decoy inheritance portfolio. Her body stilled. "Robert?" He crossed the room in 3 strides. They crouched together like conspirators reading classified information. Robert flipped through the pages quickly. Valuation summary, trust restructuring outline, liquid asset projections. Rachel's breathing changed. "This is bigger than we thought," she whispered. Robert's jaw tightened. "She never told us." Rachel shot him a look. "Why would she?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stood and scanned the room differently now. Not as a son, as an investor. "We need copies," Rachel said. Robert shook his head. "Not yet. We need to see if she's already updated anything officially." Rachel tapped the paper. "If her memory keeps slipping, we don't wait." Memory slipping. The narrative was forming. Robert crossed back to the dresser and began clearing space. He pulled out a small cardboard box labeled in my handwriting. "Robert, school years." He opened it. Inside lay report cards, a dried Mother's Day card with crooked crayon letters, a small plastic trophy from 3rd grade baseball. Rachel barely glanced at it. "Throw it," she said. Robert paused for half a second, just enough to acknowledge recognition. Then he dropped the contents into a black trash bag they had brought with them. The sound of plastic swallowing memory echoed softly in the room. On the monitor, Rose inhaled quietly beside me. I did not move. I did not open my eyes. But inside my chest, something tightened and then hardened. Robert picked up the crayon card. He read the faded letters silently. "I love you, Mommy." He stared at it, then folded it once and tossed it in with the rest. Rachel was already calculating. "If the house lists at market value," she said softly, "we can clear everything and still have margin." Margin. That was the word she used for my life. Robert stepped toward the nightstand. He opened the drawer and found my wedding ring resting inside. He lifted it carefully. For a moment, his expression changed. A flicker, a memory perhaps. Then Rachel's voice cut through. "That's gold. Don't leave it." He slipped it into his pocket. That was the moment I felt the shift. Not anger, not heartbreak, recognition. The boy who once clung to my leg in crowded stores had learned to detach efficiently. Rachel stood and surveyed the room. "We should start moving small things out gradually," she suggested, "so it doesn't feel sudden." Robert nodded slowly. "We'll tell her we're helping." Helping. Such a generous word. They gathered the portfolio folder and returned it to the drawer, careful to align it exactly as they had found it. Strategic thieves prefer subtlety. As they left the bedroom, Rachel glanced once more toward me in the living room. "She looks so small," she said. Robert didn't respond. He was already on his phone. "Yeah," he murmured quietly. "We should probably talk to someone about evaluating capacity, just to be safe." Safe. I kept my breathing steady. When the front door finally closed behind them, Rose entered the living room. Her voice was calm but firm. They escalated faster than expected. I opened my eyes slowly and looked at the empty hallway. "Yes," I said. The test was no longer theoretical, it was active. They weren't discussing the possibility of transition anymore, they were preparing it. Rose handed me the remote and replayed the moment Robert dropped the Mother's Day card into the trash bag. We watched it twice, then I pressed pause. Clarity, I whispered to myself. This was what clarity felt like. Not loud, not dramatic, just undeniable. And the escalation had only begun. The official call was placed at 8:17 a.m. Rose stood in the kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, voice controlled but urgent. "Yes," she said clearly. She collapsed, pulse weak, breathing shallow. "We need immediate assistance." Every word was documented. Every step pre-approved. No falsified medical declarations, no forged death certificates. Only a controlled scenario within legal bounds, witnessed and timed. An ambulance arrived within minutes. 2 paramedics entered the house with professional efficiency. They followed the script we had established with counsel. Transport for critical evaluation. No public announcements. No official death recorded. Only a private family notification of sudden medical crisis. Robert arrived 23 minutes later. I watched from the monitoring suite in the secured location where I had been taken after the staged transport. His car door slammed harder than necessary. He ran inside, face arranged in alarm. "What happened?" he demanded. Rose delivered the line exactly as practiced. She went into cardiac distress. It was sudden. Robert pressed his hands to his head. "Oh my God." Rachel arrived shortly after, perfectly dressed for someone who had rushed over. Her eyes widened on cue. "She was fine yesterday," she insisted. Rose nodded solemnly. "These things happen quickly at her age." At her age, Robert paced the living room, then stepped outside to make a phone call. The camera near the porch light captured everything. "I need the earliest possible service," he told the funeral director. "Yes, as soon as legally possible." Pause. "Yes, we'll move forward with the premium selection." Another pause. "And the life insurance, how soon after documentation can it be processed?" There it was. Not grief, procedure. Inside the house, Rachel had already opened her laptop. "If we handle the house valuation immediately," she murmured to Robert when he came back inside, "we won't lose time." Robert nodded, jaw tight. "We'll say she wanted everything simple." Simple. I sat in the dim monitoring room miles away, still in my black dress, hands folded in my lap. I did not feel like a ghost. I felt like a witness. Then my phone began vibrating on the table beside me. "Emily." Rose glanced at me. "You don't have to watch this part," she said quietly. "I do," I replied. She answered on speaker. Emily's voice came through shattered. No, that's not possible. I just talked to her 3 days ago." Rose kept her tone steady. It was sudden. I closed my eyes as I listened. "Mama," Emily whispered into the phone as if I might somehow hear her. "Please, please don't go. I'm coming home. I'm getting on the first flight. Don't leave me like this." Her breath hitched into sobs she couldn't control. On the monitor, Robert stood near the kitchen island, texting. Rachel leaned over his shoulder. "Did you confirm the payout structure?" she asked quietly. Robert nodded. "We'll need the death certificate before disbursement." Emily's voice cracked through the speaker again. "I should have visited sooner," she cried. "I should have stayed longer last time." Guilt, real guilt. not financial anxiety. I pressed my fingers lightly against my lips. That was when the contrast became unbearable. On one screen, my daughter, crying on an airport curb, clutching her phone like it was the last thread connecting her to me. On another, my son opening a spreadsheet. Rose lowered the phone gently after the call ended. "She loves you deeply," she said. "Yes," I whispered, and I knew it without documentation. By evening, the narrative had been set. Sudden decline, unexpected complications, peaceful passing. Robert informed extended relatives with a tone that carried just enough tremor to sound authentic. Rachel began coordinating floral arrangements, ironically, ordering from one of my own shops. They chose white lilies. They did not consult me on that, of course. Later that night, Robert returned to the funeral home. The camera inside the showroom captured him signing preliminary paperwork. He ran his hand along the satin interior of the casket again. "Mom always appreciated quality," he told the director. Then, lowering his voice, he added, "We'll keep it intimate. Quick service. Quick, efficient, contained." Back in the monitoring room, Rose paused the feed. "You've seen enough for tonight," she suggested. I shook my head slowly. "No," I said. "I need to see it through." Because clarity is not selective. It doesn't look away when the truth becomes uncomfortable. Emily's plane landed just after midnight. She drove straight to the house. The front door camera captured her collapse against it before she even rang the bell. Robert opened the door and caught her as she fell into him. She wept openly into his shoulder. He held her for the camera. His eyes, however, flicked once toward Rachel, as if checking alignment, as if confirming the next step. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly. The staged death had done what it was meant to do. It had removed uncertainty. Now only one thing remained, to attend my own funeral. The church smelled like polished wood and white lilies. My lilies, arranged in tall glass vases along the aisle, symmetrical, expensive, curated. Rachel had insisted on elegance. Robert had approved the upgraded package. I watched it all through the discreet live feed set up under full legal supervision. No intrusion, no hidden traps, just documented reality in a public space. The casket stood at the front, ivory satin glowing under soft overhead lights. Closed, reserved, final. Robert stood near the altar, greeting guests with solemn nods and carefully timed sighs. His black suit fit perfectly. His tie was the one I bought him for his first major business pitch. "I never thought this day would come so soon," he told a neighbor, pressing his lips together like he was holding back tears. The neighbor squeezed his hand. "She was such a strong woman." "Yes," Robert replied, lowering his eyes. "She gave everything for us." Rachel floated beside him in a tailored black dress, offering tissues, murmuring gratitude, adjusting details. Her composure was flawless. "She always put family first," Rachel told one of my old friends. The irony moved through me like cold air. Emily arrived 10 minutes before the service began. She looked nothing like Rachel. Her hair was unstyled, her eyes swollen from crying, her jacket wrinkled from travel. She walked down the aisle slowly, staring at the casket like it might open if she wished hard enough. She touched the wood gently with trembling fingers. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Not to the room, to me." I felt something inside my chest shift, almost painfully. The organ began to play. Guests took their seats. Robert stepped up to the pulpit. He adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat, and unfolded a sheet of paper. "My mother," he began, voice thick with rehearsed emotion, "was the foundation of our family." On the screen, I watched his posture. Chin slightly lowered, shoulders squared, controlled breathing. "She taught us resilience," he continued. "She showed us what sacrifice looks like." His phone vibrated in his hand. He glanced down, briefly. Subtle, quick, but the camera caught it. A text from a real estate agent, ready to discuss listing timeline. Robert angled the phone away from the congregation and typed a response under the podium. "Yes, after service." Then he lifted his eyes again, expression softened. "She always believed in moving forward," he said, "in not dwelling on loss." Rachel nodded from the front pew. Emily covered her face with both hands. Robert continued, "We are committed to honoring her wishes." Wishes. That word felt heavier than any accusation. He spoke about my business, about my entrepreneurial spirit, about my love for tradition. He did not speak about the pantry conversation. He did not speak about medical evaluations. He did not speak about transitioning me into containment. When he finished, polite applause filled the room. Not enthusiastic, respectful. Rachel stood next. She was like a mother to me, she said smoothly. A pause. I will miss her guidance. Guidance, the same word she used when describing how they would maneuver me into compliance. Emily couldn't bear it any longer. She stood abruptly and walked out into the side hallway, shoulders shaking. No performance, no composure, only grief. I turned to Rose beside me in the monitoring room. Are we ready? I asked. She nodded once. The attorney and officer are in position. Back in the church, Robert stepped toward a small table placed discreetly beside the casket. On it lay a set of documents he believed would finalize transitional authority, papers structured carefully by our legal team to expose intent, not transfer ownership. He picked up the pen. Rachel leaned close. Once this is done, she whispered, barely audible, we can breathe. Breathe, as if my existence had been suffocating them. Robert placed the pen against the paper. The church doors opened softly, no dramatic music, no raised voices, just the sound of heels against stone. Robert froze. The congregation turned, and I stepped into the aisle, alive, dressed in black, unhurried. For a split second, the room held no sound at all. Then a ripple of gasps moved through the pews. Emily's head snapped up from the hallway. Robert's face drained of color so quickly it looked like someone had dimmed a light inside him. Rachel's lips parted, but no words formed. I walked forward slowly, not looking at the audience, not acknowledging the whispers. Only him. When I reached the front, I stopped an arm's length away. Robert's hand was still gripping the pen. I reached up and adjusted his tie gently. The way I used to before school recitals. The way I did before job interviews. He trembled. Mom, he whispered. I tilted my head slightly. That casket is very comfortable, I said softly. You chose well. His breath caught. And the premium lining? I added. Excellent taste, especially when paid for with my own funds. The silence that followed was not chaotic. It was surgical. Because truth, when revealed at the right moment, does not need volume. It only needs timing. And the timing was perfect. For 3 full seconds, no one moved. The organist's hands hovered above the keys, suspended mid-note. A cough died somewhere in the back pew. Even the lilies seemed to hold their scent. Robert's fingers loosened around the pen. It clattered softly onto the table beside the casket. Mom, he repeated, but the word came out thin, stripped of authority. I stepped around him and faced the room. I apologize for the disruption, I said calmly, but I believe clarity is more respectful than illusion. Murmurs rippled through the congregation. Rachel found her voice first. Margaret, this is not appropriate. I turned to her gently. Neither is planning my cognitive decline over iced tea. Her composure cracked. Robert shook his head rapidly. That's not what this is. We were trying to help you. By consulting medical evaluations I never requested? I asked evenly. His silence answered for him. Daniel Reeves, my attorney, stepped forward from the side aisle, briefcase in hand. A uniformed officer stood several feet behind him, not aggressive, not dramatic, just present. Daniel addressed the room with measured professionalism. Today's events have been conducted within legal parameters to document potential financial coercion and misrepresentation concerning Mrs. Margaret Davis's assets. Robert's eyes darted toward the officer. You can't be serious. I'm very serious, Daniel replied. All recordings were made with proper authorization within privately owned property. No illegal surveillance occurred. Rachel's voice sharpened. This is entrapment. No, I said quietly. It's observation. Daniel lifted a small remote and nodded toward the projection screen behind the altar. The first clip appeared. Robert, lying inside the satin-lined casket, laughing. Gasps echoed through the pews. The second clip followed. Rachel in my kitchen, a place where she's contained. Then Robert, pocketing my wedding ring. The room shifted from shock to something colder. Recognition. Emily covered her mouth as tears spilled freely again, this time not from grief but from understanding. Robert's voice rose in desperation. You took that out of context. Daniel did not react. There are multiple timestamps, Mr. Davis, including discussions regarding accelerated sale timelines, medical capacity evaluations, and strategic asset liquidation. Rachel stepped forward. We were under financial pressure. Pressure, I repeated, does not justify erasing someone. Robert's shoulders sagged. For the first time that day, he looked less like a strategist and more like a frightened child. I didn't mean for it to go this far, he said. I studied his face carefully. Intent matters. So does action. You meant for it to go far enough, I replied. The officer spoke quietly. At this stage, no criminal charges are being filed. However, documented intent regarding fraudulent transfer attempts will be retained should further action be necessary. Rachel's expression hardened. So what now? You humiliate us publicly? No, I said. I stepped closer to the casket and rested my hand on its polished surface. This was not about humiliation, it was about truth. I turned back to the congregation. My son believed I was becoming incapable, that my life could be transitioned without my consent. Today, I simply demonstrated otherwise. The silence that followed felt different now, less chaotic, more deliberate. Robert wiped his face with unsteady hands. What happens next? He asked. I met his eyes. That depends, I said, on whether you understand what you almost buried. And for the first time since this began, the power in the room no longer belonged to illusion. It belonged to consequence. Consequence is rarely loud. It does not shout. It settles. After the final video clip faded from the screen, the church felt smaller, the air heavier. People avoided eye contact with Robert and Rachel the way polite society does when scandal becomes undeniable. Daniel stepped beside me and handed me a second folder. This contains the revocation of any provisional authority previously discussed, he said clearly, as well as documentation transferring Mrs. Davis's primary assets into a protected structure effective immediately. Robert stared at the folder as if it were a verdict. What structure? He asked hoarsely. A trust, Daniel replied, irrevocable under defined conditions, designed specifically to prevent coercive liquidation. Rachel's composure snapped. You're freezing us out. I faced her calmly. I am protecting myself. Emily moved closer to me, her hand trembling in mine. You thought I was declining, I continued evenly, so I obtained a full cognitive evaluation last week, independent, licensed, documented. Daniel lifted another paper briefly. Mrs. Davis is fully competent, he stated. The word competent echoed like a gavel. Robert looked cornered now. We never said you weren't, he protested weakly. You didn't have to, I replied. You were preparing to. Rachel crossed her arms defensively. We were drowning in debt. You have no idea what pressure we were under. I know exactly what pressure feels like, I said quietly. I built a business from nothing while raising 2 children and burying a husband. Pressure does not excuse betrayal. A low murmur of agreement moved through the pews. Daniel continued, professional and precise. The attempted steps toward unauthorized asset transfer have been documented. Should further attempts occur, legal remedies are available, including fraud investigation. The officer inclined his head slightly. The message was clear. This was a warning, not an arrest. A line drawn before damage became irreversible. Robert ran a hand through his hair, his polished image unraveling. You set us up, he whispered. No, I corrected gently. I gave you opportunity, Rachel scoffed. Opportunity to what? Fail? Opportunity to choose, I said. Silence fell again. Emily's voice broke it. You could have just asked for help, she said to Robert, tears still streaking her face. You didn't have to. Plan around her. Robert didn't look at her, because guilt is hardest to face when it comes from someone who still loves you. I stepped forward slightly, so that my heels echoing softly against the stone floor. I will not be forced into smaller rooms to make larger mistakes disappear, I said clearly to both of them. And I will not fund decisions made in secrecy. Rachel opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time since I entered the church alive, she had nothing strategic left to say. Daniel closed his briefcase. This matter concludes here today, he announced calmly. Further discussions will occur privately. The congregation began to rise slowly, whispering, glancing back, absorbing what they had witnessed. A staged funeral had turned into something else entirely. Not resurrection. Revelation. Robert stood motionless beside the casket he had selected. He looked at it differently now, not as an asset management step, as a mirror. I watched him struggle with that reflection, and I knew the next decision would not be legal. It would be moral. And that, unlike paperwork, cannot be drafted for you. The church emptied slowly, not in a rush of chaos, but in careful, measured departures. People avoided confrontation. They offered restrained nods. A few touched my arm gently as they passed, as if confirming I was solid. Emily never let go of my hand. Robert remained near the front, staring at the casket as if it had betrayed him. Rachel stood beside him, but for the first time since I had known her, she looked uncertain rather than strategic. Daniel approached me quietly. "We can leave whenever you're ready." "Not yet," I said. This was the part that mattered. I turned to face my children. "Sit," I told them calmly. They obeyed, not because they wanted to, because authority had shifted. We sat in the front pew, Emily on my right, Robert and Rachel across from me. For a moment, none of us spoke. The lilies still perfumed the air. The organist had left. The silence felt honest now. "I did not do this to destroy you," I began. Robert gave a short, humorless laugh. "It feels like it. It feels like exposure," I corrected. Rachel folded her hands tightly in her lap. "So what now? You cut us off completely?" I studied her carefully. She expected punishment. What she did not expect was boundary. "I have transferred my assets into a foundation," I said evenly. Robert blinked. "A what?" "A charitable trust, the Silent Mothers Fund." Emily squeezed my hand gently. "It will provide legal aid and housing support for widows and older women facing financial coercion." Rachel stiffened. "So strangers get everything?" "No," I replied calmly. "Women who would otherwise be quietly erased get protection." Robert leaned forward. "And us?" "You are not erased," I said. "You are redirected." He frowned, confused. "I am removing immediate inheritance," I continued. "Not permanently, conditionally." Rachel's eyes narrowed. "Conditioned on what?" "On growth." Robert shook his head. "This isn't a seminar, Mom. This is real life." "Yes," I said softly, "and real life requires accountability." I held his gaze steadily. "You will enroll in a certified financial ethics program. You will take a position in one of my flower shops, not as an executive, as staff. 6 months minimum." Rachel's expression sharpened. "That's humiliating. It's educational," I replied. Robert looked stunned. "You want me arranging bouquets?" "I want you understanding labor," I said, "the kind that built everything you nearly sold." Silence settled again. Emily finally spoke. "Maybe this is what we all needed." Robert turned to her. "You're on her side?" Emily's voice was steady now. "I'm on the side of truth." That landed harder than anything I could have said. I shifted my attention back to Robert. "I am not abandoning you," I said quietly, "but I will not finance entitlement." His shoulders sagged. For the first time that day, he did not argue. Rachel looked between us, recalculating. "And if we refuse?" she asked carefully. "Then you build your future independently," I answered. "As adults. No threat, no raised voice, just reality." Robert exhaled slowly and ran a hand over his face. "I thought we were drowning," he said quietly. "You were," I replied. "In debt, not in love." That distinction mattered. I stood. Emily rose with me. Robert remained seated for a second longer before finally standing as well. The casket still waited silently at the front of the church, a symbol of what almost happened and what did not. As we walked toward the exit, I paused once more. "Redemption," I said gently over my shoulder, "is not automatic. It is chosen." Whether he would choose it, that was no longer my decision. But the door remained open. Not for inheritance, for growth. The house felt different when I walked back in that evening. Not larger, not emptier, clearer. The floor still creaked the same way. The clock still ticked in the hallway. My husband's coat still hung where I had left it years ago. Nothing had changed physically, but the atmosphere had shifted. For weeks, this house had been quietly measured in square footage and resale value. Today, it became something else again. Ground I stood on by choice, not by negotiation. Emily stayed the night. She sat at the kitchen table long after the sun went down, holding a mug she never drank from. "I can't believe they were planning all that," she said softly. "I can," I replied. She looked at me surprised. "Greed rarely announces itself," I continued. "It whispers in practical language. Simplify, transition, contain, words that sound responsible until you examine what they remove." Robert texted once before midnight. "I need time." I stared at the message for a long moment before replying. So do I. Because forgiveness is not automatic, and neither is severance. People assume strength looks like cutting ties without hesitation, but real strength is knowing when to draw a boundary without closing the door entirely. The Silent Mothers Fund was finalized the following week. Lawyers moved carefully. Documents were filed, structures secured, not as revenge, as protection. For women who feel pressure in their own kitchens, for widows told they are too old to manage what they built, For mothers who sense the shift in tone before anyone else admits it. I did not stage my death to embarrass my son. I staged it because I realized something essential. The most expensive bed in the world is a hospital bed someone else chooses for you. And the most expensive funeral in the world cannot disguise a heart that has quietly decided you are inconvenient. Love is not proven in eulogies. It is proven in private conversations when you think no one is listening. If you are listening to this now, I want to leave you with a question. If you were in my position, if you overheard your own children discussing how to transition you out of your life, what would you do? Would you cut them off completely? Would you forgive immediately? Or would you do what I did, pause, observe, and respond with clarity instead of impulse? Boundaries are not cruelty, they are instruction. And sometimes the final test of love is not whether you are willing to sacrifice again, but whether you are willing to stop sacrificing when it enables harm. If this story moved you, share your thoughts. Have you ever felt pressured to give up control of your own life? Have you witnessed financial manipulation within a family? What would you have done differently? And if your mother is still alive, call her. Not to discuss inheritance, not to discuss logistics, but to remind her that she is not a transition plan. She is a person, because no one should have to attend their own funeral to be valued, and no mother should need to disappear to be seen.